All right. So welcome back. Hope everybody had a good weekend and Father's Day. I know I did. I had a wife got me breakfast, got me a sweet gift from her and Savannah. And it's a story time book that features me and her in it.
Oh.
I read it and it goes over all the different professions that she could possibly go into. So it's really cute. And it's got her little cartoon face. It's like her being a doctor, being a professor, and it's really cool because the one with the doctor, she's holding up an X-ray, and it's just this is just so cool. So I'm a happy dad. You feel like you're part of a club for sure.
Yeah.
How was everybody else? Everybody enjoy their weekend? I know there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, we had less quiz. And one quiz, but hey, whatever.
All right. Switch these. Okay, so how did the test go? Okay?
Yeah,
The review help?
Yeah, the only part that I found kind of confusing, I probably got them wrong.
Yeah.
On the physics test was the hypo-intense,
That's
dark,
the
and
same. Hypo and
I was
hyper.
like, what on earth
Yeah.
is hypo-intense?
And they just mean the same thing, so it was kind of...
It was a trick question.
Yeah,
it was like 5 of them.
But when it was it had hypointense dark or hypointense.
Yeah, that one I was like,
Yeah.
what?
It was I was like, I'm gonna pick one of both. I don't know.
Yeah, I was confused. So
I think I picked the one with those two.
Yeah, I think I got those wrong.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I got those wrong.
And just knowing the difference between those terms. But yeah, that was kind of, I guess, the trickiest ones on the test. But, all right, so today we're going to be going over image encoding and formation. So we're really going to be talking about spatial localization and how to spatially locate the signal that we're collecting from our patient. We have our patient going into the bore of the magnet. It's exciting those hydrogen protons. And then we usually apply an RF pulse to flip them into the transverse plane, and we have receiver coils on the patient at 90 degrees to collect that signal. But if we didn't actually change the magnetic field strength within the bore of the magnet by our gradients, we wouldn't really be able to locate that signal coming from the patient to say it's in the top of the brain, or it's in the bottom of the brain, or it's mid-slice of the brain. So these gradients are great for actually locating that signal that we're collecting from the patient. Otherwise, we would get a lot of signal on our image, but we wouldn't be able to actually locate where those little bright voxels would go on our image. It would just be a mess. So we'll talk about all the different steps of encoding today. All right. So the system must be able to locate signal spatially in all 3 dimensions. We have our y-axis, which usually gives us our, what slices? Do you remember? Coronal. What about z-axis? Axial. Nice. And then our x-axis. Good. So our gradients locate our signal spatially, but they also perform other tasks. And those tasks are really to dephase and rephase our hydrogen protons, and to do what we call slice select, frequency encoding, and phase encoding. So the first step is going to be our slice select. So we need to excite particular hydrogen protons within a slice. So we want to apply an RF pulse with a resonant frequency to that particular slice, so it excites only those hydrogen protons within that slice, and then ignores all the other slices, or all the other areas underneath that receiver coil. So that's the first step. So we want to excite just within that slice, and then we've gone from a voxel to just a pixel, because we've now limited it to just 2 more dimensions that we need to encode. So we have the slice, now we need to encode our signal in the phase direction and in the frequency direction. And usually the frequency direction is going to be the longer axis of our image. So like on an axial brain, where would the frequency direction be? Which is the longer direction on an axial brain? A to P or right to left? A to P. Yeah. That's top to bottom, but yeah. It's hard to do that spatially. But A to P would be our frequency direction, because that's the longer axis of the anatomy, and then our phase direction would be right to left. And the reason we do that is so we don't get what we call an artifact called aliasing or phase wrap. So these gradient coils are located within the bore of the magnet or the key entry. Do you remember what is our saying for how the coils are positioned within the bore? Okay, so really is our RF pulse. So that's the closest to the patient. And then gradients is that next layer of magnetic coils. So we have them, if you see this drawing up here, we have them in all three planes. So you have your X gradient, and remember, it gives us our sagittal slice. So it makes sense that you have your X gradients on the right and left of the patient. You have your Y gradients above and below the patient, because that gives us our coronal slices. And then you have the Z gradients going head to toe, which gives us our transverse slices. These are all intertwined, and they're going to be laying over top of each other. So you're going to have all three coils in all three orthogonal planes just basically intertwined with each other. The amount of current determines how strong the gradient slope is. So remember that gradient amplitude, we had that definition? So if we put more current into a coil, we're going to get a steeper gradient slope. And that's really important because that's going to give us basically a linear slope, meaning we have a slope line that's going in a linear or predictable fashion so that we can predict what precessional frequency we want to excite. And we know that if we apply current in the clockwise direction, say at the head of the gantry, we get a positive magnetic field towards the head. If we apply current in the counterclockwise direction towards the feet of the patient, we get a negative or counteracting magnetic field. So we get what we have a linear slope that looks like this. So let me draw you a line. So we get a linear slope that looks like this. When we apply current in the clockwise direction towards the head and a counterclockwise direction towards the feet. So I'll type that in. So with this gradient coil, we're going clockwise up top, and that gives us a positive. And then down here we have counterclockwise. And that gives us more of a negative magnetic field. And then what's the point right in the middle of our gradient? Isocenter. And isocenter precesses at what? What do those hydrogens spin precess at? What's their frequency? Or a what Tesla magnet? 1 Tesla magnet. Good. So they're going to be 42.57 megahertz at isocenter at all times. So think about that in all three directions. But as we apply a current in the clockwise direction towards the head, what do you think happens to our precessional frequency towards the head? Does it go up or down? It goes up because we're adding current. So it's going to increase it. So it could jump up just a little bit. So they like to explain it more in Gauss, because remember, 10,000 Gauss equal 1 Tesla. So imagine you have a 1 Tesla magnet, and right at the center is 10,000 Gauss, right? So if we add current towards the head, let's say we have 10,005 Gauss towards the head. So up here, just right, we've now increased our field strength to, let's say, 10,005 Gauss. But then down here, we've subtracted some of our field strength. So let's say 9,995 Gauss. You see that? And remember, our precessional frequency, or our alarm frequency, is proportional to field strength, right? So remember, we're applying we multiply the field strength, B0, times what? What's our other constant within the Larmor equation? What's the constant in the Larmor equation? What do we... the gyromagnetic. So that stays the exact same, right? So that's always, what's the number there? 42.57. Good. So imagine now we times 42.57 times a little bit stronger than 1 Tesla. We multiply it by 10,005 Gauss. So now what happens to our precessional frequency? Does it go up or down? It goes up in a very predictable fashion, right? So if we apply basically current within a gradient in the z direction, we're going to get a linear slope where we get a greater field strength towards the head, lesser field strength towards the feet. And we do that for all 3 orthogonal planes. Okay? So we have these slopes in all 3 directions. So that way we can actually locate signal from a very specific point. Okay? Everybody have that written down? All right, so this is just saying that gradients have many tasks. But all these tasks revolve around one principle, and that's to alter the field strength, our magnetic field strength, B sub 0. So before our gradients are turned on, we have a very uniform field strength. So you can write next to this is 42.57 precessional frequency, megahertz. But the only time it's 42.57 on the diagram above is right at the middle, and that's what we call isocenter. This little point right here, almost like the fulcrum that everything pivots on. If it's like a seesaw, you would have the fulcrum that it pivots on, and then you'd have, the kid that weighs more down here and the kid that weighs less up here. So that red spot is what we call isocenter. So now we have a linear slope when we turn these gradients on in the z direction, where we get a positive side and a negative side. And then it's very linear, which gives us a very predictable path. So we pass current through the grading coils. It either adds or subtracts to the main magnetic field. We already talked about that. Gradients speed up, magnetic field strength increases. Precessional frequency increases also because it's proportional. It's part of that Larmor frequency equation. It's altered in a linear fashion, which makes the precessional frequency we can predict those precessional frequencies. And that's important because we can apply certain precessional frequencies so that we can use our RF pulse to excite, say, a particular slice. So we don't even have to move the patient at all. With CT, they're moving through the gantry, right? Because they basically scan them and they're scanning in one area and then the patient moves through that area. With MR, we can keep them right in the middle, and then if we want to excite a slice up here, we just apply a little bit higher current. Our precessional frequency is a little bit more now, so we excite the hydrogen protons within this slice. If we want to move us down a slice a little bit lower, we just reduce the amount of current. Or we just select a RF band that's a little bit lower in precessional frequency. And we can do that all the way down through all our slices. All right, so this is a great slide just for review. So our Z gradient alters field strength along the long axis, or axial slices. So over here. So let's just color code these. So Z gradient, long axis, this one. Orange Y gradient. Our vertical axis gives us our coronal slices. So A to P. And then x gradient, horizontal axis, gives us our sagittal slices. So see how our sagittal slices are basically going to be 90 degrees from that axis. So for our sagittal slices, it's going to look something like this. You see that? So we have green. So we're going 90 degrees from that axis. That's what gives us our sagittal slices. And then for orange, 90 degrees from this y-axis. So this gives us our coronals. Okay. So your slices are determined by 90 degrees from the axis that is excited. So I'm basically drawing these lines here, Tiffany. So you see how the y gradient alters field strength in the vertical axis. So this big arrow right here, that's orange, right? So then you actually acquire slices that are 90 degrees from that long axis. So then these are the actual slices that occur. And that's A to P, which gives us our coronal. Because remember, our patient's laying, if we're looking at the patient, this is going to be the feet of the patient. They're going into the bore of the magnet. And this is going to be anterior, this is going to be posterior. This is going to be right, this is going to be left. I can write that on there. This is right. This is left. This is anterior. And this is
Cross section.
posterior. Exactly. And then if we have it over here, this is the foot of the patient. This is the head of the patient. Okay? And then 90 degrees from the long axis of the z gradient will give us our axial slices. So I'll draw that in red here. So it's going to look like this. Okay? And a way to get an oblique slice, because we know the anatomy in our body is not always going to be perfectly in a grid. We have like the abdominal aorta or the thoracic aorta. It looks like a candy cane. It's going to be kind of oblique. Any other structure that you can think of that are going to be oblique in our body?
Muscles.
Some muscles, yeah. Kidneys, good job, kidneys, because you got the upper pole and the lower pole. They're going to be sitting at a different axis. So these are the things where we can apply an oblique slice, where we actually apply two gradients in combination. So if we turn on the z gradient while we turn on the y gradient, we get a axial coronal oblique. If we turn on the y gradient and an x gradient, we get a coronal sagittal oblique. Okay? That way we don't ever have to move the patient. We can basically change our slices according to their anatomy, which is great. Because we know, in X-ray, we already found that out, where not many people are going to be able to move, and we had to think about getting a cross-table lateral, things like that. Now we kind of have to think about it in the MRI world, where they're not going to be able to move. We need to kind of work around that. Okay, so to acquire a steep gradient with a higher gradient amplitude, we basically apply more current into those wires. And when we do that, that linear slope is a lot steeper. You see that? We have a lot steeper linear slope. So we get a greater change in magnetic field strength and precessional frequency. So here, see how the field strength, it's expressed in Gauss, goes from 9,700 all the way up to 10,300. So we get a greater range in magnetic field strength, which equates to a greater range in precessional frequency. Because remember, that's part of that Larmor equation, it's proportional. But if we apply a shallow gradient, where we're basically pumping less current into those coils, we're going to get a more shallow gradient. So we get a smaller range in field strength and a smaller range in precessional frequency. So the distance between 2 points, so if I measured this point in terms of field strength or precessional frequency, we're going to get a greater distance between this point and this point with a steeper gradient compared to this point and this point with a shallow gradient. So we get greater range of magnetic field and precessional frequency, a smaller range of magnetic field and precessional frequency. Okay. So the other tasks of our gradients are what we call encoding. So we're obviously going to be exciting a slice in, say, an axial, coronal, or sagittal, but they also have to do these tasks too. The first one is going to be called slice selection. The second is going to be frequency encoding, which occurs along the long axis of the anatomy. Which would be the long axis of the anatomy for a humerus? Head to foot, and then what would be the short axis?
Medial to lateral.
Yeah, right to left, or even A to P, right? Because like this distance is not very long too, right? So just know that the frequency is always going to be that head to foot because it's a very long bone. Good. And then our phase encoding is going to be the short axis of the anatomy, and that's due to we don't want an artifact called aliasing or phase wrap. So we'll cover artifacts later on, but I just want to relate it to why we do not put the long axis as the phase. We want the short axis because to reduce aliasing, or it's also called phase wrap. And another good reason we always put the phase encoding as the shorter axis because the number of phase encoding steps is part of what? Scan time equation. Okay. And that scan time equation is scan time equals TR. What's TR stand for?
Repetition.
Good. Times number of phase encodings times, what's the last?
Yeah.
Okay. And is that an extrinsic or intrinsic parameter? Is this something we can change on our console?
Yeah.
Okay. All of these are something we can change. So all these parameters that I just listed, TR, phase encoding, and next, are things that we can change on our MR console. So that's why we can change our scan time. So that's why we can reduce the amount of time that the patient is being scanned. Which is good, right? Because we know certain patients can't take the 45-minute MRI scan.
Especially the running late.
So over here, this little diagram, this is your first introduction to what we call a pulse sequence diagram. So this is your first introduction to a pulse sequence, and we're going to cover this even more in the next couple chapters. And what's going on here is we apply, what do you think this stands for, this 90? Flip angle. And the first rectangle is our RF pulse. Remember, we apply an RF pulse at the same precessional frequency as our spins. It excites them due to resonance. It puts energy into the patient. And now they're able to oppose that static magnetic field and flip into the transverse plane. So that's what that rectangle 90 means. It's an RF pulse, RF excitation pulse, applied at 90-degree flip angle. little smaller. So this is an RF excitation pulse at 90 degrees. Okay? And having it 90 is great, right? Why? Why is 90 the optimal flip angle? Why not 5? Why not 96? What happens when we push it past that 90 degrees? Partial saturation, or 180, it's full saturation, right? And then even less than 90, we just don't get as much signal. So 90 for a spin echo pulse sequence is the optimal flip angle. All right, so then what is this little thing going back and forth right here? What does that denote or signify?
The resonance?
Not the resonance. Not the frequency. It is the amplitude. It's going down. So what happens? What's it called when the signal goes down?
That's decay.
But what type?
Free induction.
Good. Remember that curve we drew before? So free induction decay. That's what that is. So anytime we turn off that RF pulse. Remember those? We flipped it into 90, and those spins were spinning very coherently. Remember that in phase coherent spins. So they're spinning in phase, and they're in the transverse plane. We turn off that RF pulse. Remember, the tissues start to relax back up the longitudinal axis. So we start to lose signal very rapidly. You could call this T2 decay, or you could just basically say free induction decay, because remember, that signal starts to go down to 0. Remember our T2 decay curve we went over last time. Okay. So it's really important to remember that anytime we turn on any type of RF pulse, whether it's our RF excitation pulse or this next one, which we'll cover, is an RF rephase pulse, because we're going to be rephasing the spins. And then, once again, down here, we have our next RF excitation pulse. You can say number 2. So this time, between the first RF pulse and the second RF pulse, is what we call our TR, repetition time. So that's basically when we're changing our repetition time, we're changing the amount of time between our excitation pulses. But going back to slice selection, our slice select gradient here in red is being turned on anytime we have one of these RF pulses turning on. So if you see that on a pulse sequence diagram, you'll always notice that your slice select gradient turns on at the exact same time as the 90, 180, and 90. You see that? And that's because, remember, we're trying to excite hydrogen protons within a particular slice. So we only select, say, this slice in my abdomen, and then all the other slices in your brain, in your feet, in your pelvis, don't get excited. We don't want to excite those, because we only want to resonate the ones within the slice, so that we only get signal from the ones in the slice. Okay? So we only excite that particular slice. And then what happens is that signal starts to decay from that slice, and so we apply a slice select gradient. It turns on when we apply the rephasing pulse. So that signal starts to decay, and we apply basically a 180 rephasing pulse, so that signal starts to regrow. So see over here, this is the signal regrowing after we apply a 180 refocusing pulse. It regrows to what we call this peak amplitude right here is our TE. And our TE is basically from the 90 excitation pulse all the way to peak amplitude. So those are the two parameters we really talked about last time, right? TR and T. Which one controls T2, do you think? Which one controls T1 recovery? Good. All right, so this slice is just saying that when we excite hydrogen protons within a particular slice, we're basically applying an RF pulse to that particular processional frequency. So remember how our linear slope changes our processional frequencies. So if we want to apply maybe more towards the top of the head, we apply a processional frequency a little stronger, and we apply more current within that gradient coil. We excite just the top of the brain slice, and then we ignore all the other spins within the brain. Because we just want to excite that particular slice. So this is just saying the gradient switched on. The magnetic field strength has now changed. So the processional frequency, which is proportional, is also altered in a very linear or predictable fashion. Nuclei within the slice have that same processional frequency. So therefore, we can be very slice selective and excite by transmitting our RF pulse to that exact processional frequency. We apply energy to that exact processional frequency, and we ignore all the other processional frequencies. That way, the hydrogen spins within that slice are going to resonate, and then the ones outside that slice do not resonate. And remember, if they don't resonate, they don't get that efficient energy transfer. And there's not going to be enough energy to flip them into the transverse plane. So here's a great little representation of what actually is happening. So remember those tuning forks I talked about? Where say you hit a C note tuning fork, and you brought it closer together to another C note tuning fork. You don't actually have to have them touch. For this one that's vibrating because you hit it, for this one to start vibrating. Okay? And you never even had to touch it because there's an efficient energy exchange due to resonance. So we get now energy, and we can pull the one that was initially hit away, and this one still vibrates. Okay? So that's what we call resonance. So what we do when we're slice selecting, we're hitting one tuning fork, say A, and you're bringing it within that slice, closer to that slice, and we're exciting, say, the tuning fork in position A. So then it resonates, and that's the only slice that's going to basically apply energy to those hydrogen spins, flip them into the transverse axis. So we're only going to get those hydrogen protons excited in this slice. Okay? So let me show you the linear slope again. So here's our linear slope. So do you think with tuning fork A, we're applying a processional frequency more or less than 42.57? Less. You see that? Because remember, this is the negative side. This is the more positive side. So what, if you had to predict a processional frequency, what do you think it would be? Just give me a number.
38.
38. What they had, see, it's up here. 41.2 megahertz. That's what was applied. It excited that particular slice, and only those hydrogen spins are flipped into the transverse axis. So let me draw a rectangle to get you a better idea of what I mean by exciting a slice. So here is the slice that we're exciting. Just A. So all these other slices outside of A are not being excited. Let's draw our patient again. So here's our patient's foot. Here's their head. So imagine this is their ankle, right? We have an axial slice in the ankle, closer to, say, the Achilles tendon, that we're excited. Because we're only concerned with these tiny little hydrogen protons within that slice. Okay? Because you remember, you have hydrogen protons all throughout this scanner, but we want to only excite the ones within that slice. Okay. Now, on this end, tuning fork B, what precessional frequency do you think we're applying now? A greater or lesser precessional frequency? Greater. Everybody see that, right? Oops. Go back. Here's isocenter. This is the stronger part of the magnet, and we're exciting this slice. Okay? So if I bring my patient down here, what area of the patient are we scanning now?
Chest.
Neck, chest, more towards the head, right? Because we're exciting protons in that particular area. Okay? See how we're able to just excite certain hydrogen protons within a spatially encoded area. So this is just saying that this is when that slice select gradient is going to be turned on. See how this little, basically, lobe. So these little rectangles are called lobes. So since it's an orange, I'll just write next to lobe. We have a positive lobe every time our RF pulse is turned on. So going back to this diagram, this is actually combining all of the gradients onto one line. That's not an actual true representation of what a pulse sequence diagram looks like. This is what a pulse sequence diagram actually looks like. So I'll type up here. This is, once again, pulse sequence. And then your first line of a pulse sequence diagram is always going to be your RF. Your second line of pulse sequence diagram is going to be, what is this line? Okay, slice selection. Our third, and we'll start to cover these, this is phase encoding. Our fourth is frequency encoding. And then this is really just our signal. This is the way it looks throughout the pulse sequence. We know that this initially is our free induction decay, and this peak amplitude is our TE. Basically when we're going to be reading out the signal. And we have what we call this is our readout gradient that turns on anytime we're collecting the signal. So this is called our readout gradient, or frequency gradient. And it turns on anytime we're starting to read out the signal. And we usually select the TE right at the peak amplitude, because we want as much signal from that echo. And this signifies how long that gradient is turned on. And that's called the sampling window. So how long that gradient is turned on. Here's our phase encoding direction. And this is our gradient. And you can actually select a different phase shift per TR period. Remember, TR is 90 to 90. So you're going to select a different one each TR period. So this is our positive end of our phase encoding gradient, because it's above our central line here. And then this is the negative polarity of our phase encoding gradient. So as we fill K-space each TR period, we select a different polarity of our phase encoding gradient to fill different lines of K-space. So remember, K-space is eventually where we put all this signal from the patient. Then we put it through the what? K-space is not the image. We still have to put it through that mathematical formula called the fast Fourier transformer, which is located within what? The array processor. Then that creates our MR image. Good. Everybody got that written down?
Yeah.
Second. Okay. All right, so how do we determine how thick that slice is? So we know we can excite a particular slice, but remember, we want sometimes really thin slices. When do we really deal with thin slices in MRI? What type of imaging? What do you think? Where is it really important to have really good spatial resolution? Really thin slices. Brain? Okay slices. They're more of like a 5 millimeter slice. Huh? Muscles, yeah, muscles, but what part of the skeletal system? What do you think? Orthopedic stuff. So MSK imaging, you have really thin slices, usually 3 millimeters and below. So that's why, even though it's like a small wrist, right? We still have to get, say, 10 to 15 slices through that wrist, because we keep our slice thickness really small to detect maybe like a small, what kind of fracture would be very hard to see on the x-ray? Hairline fracture, stress fracture. We can see those things a lot better on MRI compared to x-ray because we get way better spatial resolution and better just image quality in general, where we can see the difference between our tissues. Where do we want thicker slices? We already said like the brain. Brain's like 5 millimeters. So that's not considered very thick. That's like average.
My abdomen?
Abdomen, right? Because we're covering a very large area, right? So 5 millimeters and above for the abdomen and pelvis, kind of soft tissue pelvis. But if it's an MSK pelvis, still at our 3 millimeters. Because there's difference in MRI. Sometimes you scan the pelvis to look at the female anatomy or the male anatomy. And that's really dealing with the soft tissues in the pelvis. But sometimes you scan the pelvis in MRI where we just look at the bone of the pelvis. And that's more of an MSK thing. Okay? So female pelvis, we'd be looking at fibroids in the uterus. Things like that. Endometriosis. But if it's an MSK pelvis, we're looking for stress fractures or maybe a tumor of the bone or something like that. So, what determines our slice thickness is what we call our transmit bandwidth. Our transmit bandwidth is that range of frequencies that we excite. So write that down. Range of frequencies. Because remember, I told you in the past that we really were concerned with applying an RF pulse exactly to the precessional frequency. But what really happens if we still apply an RF pulse to 42.57, but then we actually give a range around 42.57. So it's not very much. It's in kilohertz, not megahertz. And it usually ranges about 2 to 5 kilohertz. So a very small window, but we apply it to that precessional frequency, and then we give it a range. The wider the range, or more broad, what do you think? Is this a bigger slice, thicker slice, or thinner slice? A wider range of frequencies. A wider range of frequencies? We're exciting more, wider range, a thicker slice. We're narrowing down our transmit bandwidth, a smaller range, a thinner slice. So that goes to right here. So a thin slice, narrow transmit bandwidth. Or we could say thick slice, broad transmit bandwidth. That range of frequencies. But we could actually keep our transmit bandwidth the same and not ever really mess with it because that's really something we don't mess with on our MR console. You'll never really see transmit bandwidth anywhere on your MR console. The only thing you'll see is slice thickness. So you can go up and down on your slice thickness, but you can't ever change the transmit bandwidth. You can change the receiver bandwidth. We'll talk about that later on. But don't ever get it confused. You can never actually change transmit bandwidth on your MR console. You can change how thick a slice is by just going up to 4 millimeters or 5 millimeters down to 3 millimeters. When you change your slice thickness, most of the time it really either creates a more steep or more shallow slice select gradient or slope. So imagine if the transmit bandwidth stayed the same. So here we have an example where the transmit bandwidth is the exact same. Say we have a range of 43 megahertz at the top end, and then down at the bottom we have 41 megahertz. And the only thing that's changing is how much current we're pumping into that slice select gradient. If we pump in more current, look at how our linear slope is a lot more steep. And when we have a very steep gradient combined with a narrow transmit bandwidth, see how our slice selection is going to be very thin. Here is our slice right here. So all of this area right here gets excited. Okay? I cannot color within the dotted lines. So that's where we're selecting a steep slice select gradient. All right, so let's just take that away. Now if our slice select gradient is shallow, and remember we still have the same range of transmit bandwidth, see how this shallow gradient creates a thicker slice. Because here are the range of frequency, and this gradient cuts right through it, and then our slice is now going to be a lot thicker. Okay? So this is more likely what's happening in your MR system. You don't really ever change the transmit bandwidth. You can actually change how much current goes through that slope, or that coil. Okay, so here's your shallow. All right, so Jenny, give me 2 ways to get a thick slice. 2 different ways.
Wide frequency.
Okay, what's that called, that frequency? What's another name for it? The bandwidth. Transmit bandwidth. So broad or wide transmit bandwidth, and then what's another way that you can get a thick slice? Anybody help her out?
Shallow slope.
A shallow slope. Good. Less current. Shallow slope equals less current going through that coil. All right. So now we've excited within a slice. So now our next step is to encode the signal in the 2 directions of that slice.
Says shallow slope equals
Shallow
more
slope.
current or less
Less
current.
All right. So we've gone from 3-dimensional. Now we're only down to 2-dimensional. We're starting to knock off, some of these tasks. So our next task is to encode the signal in the frequency direction, which is the long or the short axis in that?
The long.
The long. Good. This is typically switched on when the signal is received. That's why it's also called the readout gradient. You're reading out the signal. You're collecting that signal the frequency encoding gradient determines your field of view. What's your field of view? It's similar to X-ray. What's the field of view in X-ray? Could be, but basically what your collimated field is, right? So if you open up your collimators to get more light on your image, you have a larger field of view, right? If you really tighten up your collimated field, you have a very small field of view. So I guess you could equate it to your collimated field of view. But in MRI, if you have just that rectangle on your image, it's the large rectangle that you're basically moving around, okay? That's your field of view, the area of coverage that you're going to excite. So for a brain, we go from basically the very top of the skull all the way to the bottom, the base of the skull, or that opening at the base of the skull. What's that called? Frame of magnet. Yep. So our field of view would be from the top of the skull down to the frame of magnet. Frequency field of view. And the steepness of that frequency encoding gradient determines the size of the field of view. So let's write this down. So what do you think a steep... Oh, wait, let me write it down a little bit bigger. A steep frequency encoding gradient will give us. Do you think it will give us a smaller field of view or larger field of view? Smaller. And then a shallow. Give us a large. All right. Everybody got that written down?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's it.
Got it?
Good? Okay. Yeah, Jasmine, you okay? Oh.
Last one. This one.
Shallow frequency encoding gradient equals large field of view. Oh, it's right there. I could just hit back. Still learning all the capabilities. Good? All right. So we'll go to the next slide here. All right. So once again, what is this whole thing right here? Not the whole thing. The whole thing. This whole
Pulse diagram.
Okay.
Sequence
So
diagram.
once again, this is our. I'm going to give you a pulse sequence. Okay. What is our first line? RF pulse. Good. What does the 90 stand for? Flip angle. And then what does the rectangle stand for above? What kind of RF pulse is this?
Low.
Excitation pulse. Remember, this is when that excitation pulse basically means we're starting our pulse sequence. We're exciting those hydrogen protons to oppose the static magnetic field. We're starting this whole thing. Just think this is the gun of a race. Excitation pulse. Boom. Let's get this thing going. This is what we call a refocusing pulse, a rephasing pulse. It's 180 because basically our signal starts to decay. Remember, this is our signal. That's last line. Signal. This is what we're collecting from the patient. After we turn off that 90-degree excitation pulse, our signal starts to decay due to what we call D2 decay. Our signal is going down. Okay? And then we need to refocus that signal because we can't have a TE very short in some instances, especially with a spin echo pulse sequence. So we need to have this signal regrow. So we apply what we call a refocusing pulse, where that signal, as it goes down, starts to regrow. And then we sample the signal at the highest peak amplitude. What's that time? What's this? The middle of our readout is our TE. Good. This is our TE. Right at peak amplitude. And TE is a time frame from your excitation pulse to peak amplitude. Our TR is from 90 to 90. So our TR is always going to be longer than our TE. And remember those numbers that I gave you last unit? The TR you always saw was longer than your TE, right? Because remember, the TR recovery is happening at the same time as T2 decay. Well, which one happens faster? Signal decays a lot faster than it does recover. These are two things that are happening at the exact same time. They're independent processes, but T2 decay happens a lot faster than T1 recovery. So that's why you'll always see the TE will come before the TR. TR is from here to here. And then TE is from here to here. So that millisecond is going to be less. All right? What is the second line of the pulse sequence?
SS.
What's that stand for?
Slice select.
Good. Slice select. And notice how that low always turns on every time an RF pulse gets turned on. Because we have to excite just those hydrogen spins within that slice. What is the next line?
Encoding.
Awesome. And remember, we have different polarities with that. And then what's this line? Fourth line. It's already written on there. Frequency encoding. And then remember, this is called our readout gradient because we're reading out the signal as it's being collected. This is all the good signal that we want from the patient. And basically, we take this right here and we throw it into one of these lines of K-space. We just, depending on the phase encoding direction, say we select a negative lobe that's very steep, this is going to determine we're going to put it right here, and then the signal goes into this line. So it really looks like this signal right here looks very similar within this row, where it peaks out and then it goes down like that. Okay? So that's what's happening. And you're going to select different data points along that signal to give you your frequency encoding direction. So if you have more data points, do you think we have a large field of view or a small field of view? Large field. More data points, large field of view. Small amount of data points, smaller field of view. Good. All right, so we'll stop right there, and we'll pick that up next time. Any questions? I know that's a lot. We're starting encoding, but we're also introducing some of these pulse sequence diagrams. And this will help out, though, when we start to cover pulse sequence diagrams. So if you guys want to start reading the pulse sequence chapter, that's something you can do, too. But I'm not going to be testing on any of that stuff for this unit, but it really starts to kind of lead you into it.